The sky over the Montana Territory didn't just turn gray, it turned a bruised, suffocating purple that pressed down against the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. Winter here was a predator, patient and lethal. Clara Thorne stood by the frosted window of her cabin, her breath blooming in small white clouds against the glass. Outside, the world was vanishing. The fence line was already buried, and the barn, usually a sturdy sentinel of their survival, was a flickering ghost in the swirling white. "Mama, the wind sounds like it's screaming," a small voice whispered. Clara turned. Her son, Silas, sat by the hearth, hugging his knees. At 7 years old, he had the eyes of a man who had seen too many winters and too few friends. Beside him, Clara's mother, Martha, moved with a heavy limp, feeding the last of the split pine into the stove. "It's just the mountains talking, Silas," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. Her life was a fortress of silence. 2 years ago, her stepfather, a silver-tongued devil named Elias Thorne, had been gunned down in a muddy street in Blackwood. He hadn't just been a thief. He'd been a murderer. When the law finally caught him, the town didn't stop at his grave. They buried Clara and her mother in a different way, with cold stares, short waits at the general store, and the kind of silence that made a person feel like a ghost while they were still breathing. Clara pulled on her heavy sheepskin coat and wound a wool scarf around her face. "I have to check the livestock. If the door drifts shut, I won't get back in." "Be careful, daughter," Martha warned. "The cold doesn't care about your penance." The moment Clara stepped outside, the air slapped the lungs out of her. It was minus 30 degrees, and the wind whipped ice crystals like shards of glass against her skin. She fought toward the barn, her boots sinking into waist-deep drifts. Every step was a battle of will. She reached the barn door, her fingers numb inside her mittens. But as she reached for the heavy timber latch, she stumbled. Her boot struck something solid, something that wasn't a log. She looked down. A dark shape was slumped against the rough-hewn cedar of the barn. At first she thought it was a dead wolf, but then she saw the flash of a brass belt buckle and the edge of a Stetson hat pinned against the snow. "Oh, God," she gasped, her voice swallowed by the gale. She knelt, rolling the figure over. It was a man. His face was a mask of frost, his eyelashes frozen shut. His duster coat was shredded, and a dark frozen stain bloomed across his side, turning the snow beneath him into a grim, rusted ice. Clara hesitated. The town's voices hissed in her mind. Thief's daughter, trouble bringer, helping a stranger, a shot man, was an invitation for the law, or worse. But then she looked at his hands, blue, clawed, and desperate. She knew that desperation. She lived it every time she walked into town and felt the world turning its back on her. "I won't let the cold have you," she hissed through gritted teeth. She grabbed him under the armpits. He was a dead weight, a mountain of muscle and damp wool. She hauled him inch by inch, screaming against the wind, her own muscles burning with a fire that the blizzard couldn't quench. By the time she kicked the cabin door open and dragged him across the threshold, she collapsed beside him, her lungs heaving. Martha gasped, clutching her crucifix. "Clara, who is this?" "A man," Clara panted, stripping off her frozen gloves. "A man the world forgot." They laid him on the long oak table. Silas watched from the shadows, his eyes wide, as Clara peeled back the man's duster. The wound was jagged. A lead ball had entered the meat of his thigh and stayed there, festering in the cold. "Silas, get the water boiling, now," Clara commanded. She didn't have a doctor's kit. She had a bone-handled hunting knife, a bottle of cheap rye whiskey, and a sewing needle. She put the knife in the stove until the blade glowed a dull, angry orange. "Hold his shoulders, Mama," Clara said. As the hot steel touched his skin, the man's eyes flew open. They were a piercing, stormy gray. A guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the cabin. "Keep him down!" Clara yelled over the roar of the storm. She dug. It was a brutal, visceral business. The smell of scorched flesh and iron filled the small room. Sweat poured down Clara's face despite the chill. With a sickening clink, the flattened lead ball hit the floorboards. She worked with the grim efficiency of a woman who had learned that survival didn't have time for daintiness. She stitched him with heavy thread, her hands steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. For 3 days, the man drifted in the Red Sea of fever. He babbled in his delirium, names like Thomas and Margaret, and words like coward and fire. Clara sat by his side, spooning broth into his mouth and wiping his brow. She watched the way his jaw set, even in sleep, a man at war with his own ghosts. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun rose over a world of blinding, pristine white. The man's eyes opened, clear and focused this time. He looked at the rafters, then at Clara. "You're in my home," she said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. "I'm Clara Thorne. This is Silas and Martha." The man tried to sit up, hissing in pain. "My horse." "Gone to the wind, I reckon," Clara said. "You were dying against my barn. Who are you?" He remained silent for a long moment, as if searching for a name he hadn't used in a long time. "Rhett," he finally whispered. "Rhett Dakett." "Well, Rhett Dakett," Clara said, standing up and smoothing her apron. "You're alive. Whether that's a blessing or a curse remains to be seen." As the weeks passed and the snow began to settle, Rhett Dakett became a fixture in the house. He was a man of few words, but his presence was heavy, like a loaded gun on a mantelpiece. He watched Silas with a curious, tragic softness. One evening, while Clara was mending a harness, Rhett spoke. He was sitting by the fire, his leg propped up. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. "In this country, a man bleeding out in a storm is usually a man best left to the crows. You didn't know if I was a bushwhacker or a saint." Clara didn't look up. "The people in Blackwood think I'm the daughter of a devil, Rhett. They look at Silas and see a thief in the making. I know what it's like to be judged before you even open your mouth. I figured if the world was going to be cruel to you, I might as well be the one person who wasn't." Rhett leaned back, the firelight dancing in his gray eyes. "I worked a spread in Wyoming for a man named Thomas Garrett. Best man I ever knew. Claim jumpers came in the night. They burned the main house with him inside. I took a bullet trying to get to the door, but the heat, the lead, I couldn't get through. His daughter, Margaret, she looked at me like I'd killed him myself. Called me a coward while the ashes were still hot." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. "I've been running from that look ever since. Just a drifter with a hole in his soul where a man's courage used to be." "You aren't a coward, Rhett," Silas piped up from the corner, where he was carving a piece of cedar. "You fought the storm. My mama says only the brave bother to stay alive when it hurts." Rhett looked at the boy, and for the first time, a small, pained smile touched his lips. It was the first crack in his armor. The Bitterroot winter began to loosen its grip, but the thaw brought a different kind of cold. As the trails cleared, the isolation that had protected the Thorne homestead evaporated. The world was coming back, and it was as sharp-toothed as ever. Rhett Dakett was no longer a ghost on a table. He had become the heartbeat of the farm. He moved with a persistent limp, but his hands, strong and capable, transformed the property. He repaired the sagging roof of the porch, reinforced the corral, and spent hours teaching Silas how to track elk in the softening mud. For Silas, Rhett wasn't just a drifter. He was a shield. The boy's laughter, once a rare and precious thing, now rang out across the clearing. But for Clara, the growing bond was a source of quiet terror. She watched Rhett from the kitchen window, her heart aching with a hope she didn't want.
"You're looking at him like he's water and you're a desert, Clara," Martha said one afternoon, her voice soft but knowing. "He's a traveler, Mama," Clara snapped, though there was no venom in it. "Spring comes, the mud dries, and men like Rhett Dakett find a new horizon. That's the way of things." "Maybe," Martha mused, "but some men only run because they haven't found a place worth standing their ground for." By mid-March, their supplies were dangerously low. The flour barrel scraped bottom, and the coffee was little more than chicory and dust. Clara knew she had to face the town. She hitched the wagon, her jaw set in a grim line. Rhett stepped off the porch, his hand resting on the holster at his hip, a habit he hadn't lost. "Let me go with you," Rhett said. "No," Clara replied firmly. "If they see me with a man like you, a man they don't know, it'll only make the whispers louder. Stay here. Watch Silas." The ride into Blackwood was a gauntlet of judgment. As the wagon wheels creaked down the main street, conversations died. Women pulling laundry from lines paused to stare. Men on the boardwalk spat tobacco juice into the dirt as she passed. At Miller's General Store, the air was thick with the smell of brine and wood smoke. Clara placed her list on the counter. "Morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice steady. The storekeeper, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, didn't look up. He flicked the list with a greasy finger. "Prices went up, Claire. Freight costs. Hard winter." $1 for a sack of flour?" Clara gasped. "That's double what you charged the sheriff's wife 10 minutes ago. I saw her through the window." Miller finally looked at her, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. "The sheriff's wife doesn't have a murderer's blood in her veins. She doesn't bring a curse into my shop. You want the flour, you pay the thorn tax. Or you can go hungry. See if the crows care about your reputation." A group of local women near the fabric bolts tittered. "I heard she's got a man out there now," one whispered loudly. "Just like her mother, bringing in drifters to do the devil's work." Clara felt the heat rise in her neck. She wanted to scream, to upend the jars of peppermint and tell them all how she had saved a man's life while they sat by their warm fires. Instead, she took her meager supplies, half of what she needed, and walked out. She didn't cry until she was 3 miles out of town. She pulled the wagon over under a stand of weeping willows and let the sobs rack her body. She was tired of being strong. She was tired of being a target for people who didn't even know the color of her soul. When she returned, she tried to hide the redness of her eyes, but she couldn't hide the near-empty wagon. Rhett was waiting by the barn. He didn't ask questions. He saw the small sack of flour and the lack of coffee, and he saw the way Clara wouldn't look him in the eye. That night, while the house was silent, Rhett sat on the porch, cleaning his sidearm. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, a Colt single-action Army with an ivory grip, the metal blued to a deep, oily sheen. It was his life. In the West, a man without a gun was a man without a name, a man who couldn't protect what was his. He looked at the cabin door. He heard Silas's light snoring and the soft creak of Clara's rocking chair. The next morning, Rhett was gone before the sun cleared the peaks. He rode Clara's spare horse into Blackwood. He didn't go to the store. He went to the saloon, where the local cattlemen gathered. He walked to the bar, ignored the stairs, and laid his Colt on the scarred wood. "I'm looking to sell," Rhett said to the bartender. The room went quiet. A gun like that was worth a fortune on the frontier. $50, a rancher called out from a corner table. "It's worth 80, Rhett said, his voice like grinding stones. "To a man who can keep it, maybe," the rancher smirked. "But you look like a man who needs the money more than the lead." Rhett didn't flinch. 70, and I want it in credit at Miller's store, under the name Clara Thorne. Not a cent less. The deal was struck. Rhett walked out of the saloon, lighter, his holster empty and flapping against his leg. You felt naked. You felt vulnerable. But as he walked into Miller's and watched the storekeeper's eyes go wide at the credit note, a different kind of strength took hold of him. That evening, a delivery wagon from town arrived at the Thorne farm. It was loaded high, barrels of flour, crates of coffee, sugar, salt pork, and even a bolt of fine blue silk. Clara stood on the porch, stunned. "There's been a mistake. I didn't order this." "Paid for in full," the driver said, tipping his hat. "Credit of Rhett Dackett." The driver left, and silence reclaimed the yard. Rhett stood by the pump, washing the trail dust from his face. Clara walked down the steps, her heart hammering. She looked at his hip. The holster was empty. "Rhett, what did you do?" she whispered. "We needed supplies," he said simply. "That gun, it was everything you had. It was your protection, your past." Rhett stepped toward her. The setting sun cast long, amber shadows across the snow. "No, Clara, it was a weight. I've spent my life pulling that trigger to solve problems, and it never brought me anything but grief. You saved my life with a needle and thread. The least I can do is make sure you don't go hungry for the sin of being kind to me." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, before he pulled it back, unsure. "I don't have much left to give, Clara. But as long as I'm breathing, nobody in that town is going to make you cry again." Clara didn't pull away this time. She stepped into him, burying her face in his chest. For the first time in 2 years, the fortress of her silence crumbled, replaced by the steady, rhythmic beating of a heart that beat for her. But the peace was short-lived. In the distance, the sound of multiple horses echoed through the canyon. The town was coming to the Thorne farm, and they weren't bringing groceries. The dust from the approaching riders hung in the air like a shroud. Leading the pack was Pastor Yates, a man whose piety was as sharp and cold as a winter frost, flanked by Sheriff Miller and 3 grim-faced town elders. They didn't dismount. They sat atop their horses, looking down at the Thorne porch as if it were a site of infection. "Clara Thorne," Yates bellowed, his voice vibrating with practiced authority. "We've heard tell of the company you're keeping. A drifter in the house of a lone woman, and a woman of your family's checkered history, is a rot that Blackwood will not tolerate." Clara stepped forward, her hand gripping the porch railing so hard the wood groaned. Rhett stood a pace behind her, his posture straight despite his empty holster. "He's a man who would have died if I hadn't taken him in, Pastor," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear. "Is that what your Bible teaches? To let the wounded freeze?" "It teaches us to avoid the appearance of evil," Yates countered. "You live in sin, Clara. You're a mother. If you won't think of your soul, think of the boys. The council has decided. Either this man is gone by Sunday sunrise, or Silas will be removed from this house and placed with a family of proper standing. A home where he won't learn the ways of thieves and harlots. The world seemed to tilt. Silas, huddled in the doorway behind Martha, let out a small, choked sob. Rhett's jaw tightened. He stepped into the light, his gray eyes burning like hot ash. "I'll leave," he said quietly. "If it keeps the boy safe, I'll be gone before the moon sets." The riders nodded, satisfied by his submission, and turned their horses back toward town. That night, the cabin was a tomb. Rhett sat by the fire, packing his few belongings into a bedroll. Silas refused to leave his side, clutching a wooden horse Rhett had carved for him. "You can't go," Silas whispered. "You're my friend." "Sometimes friends have to leave so the people they love can stay," Rhett said, his voice thick with a grief he hadn't felt since Wyoming. Clara watched them from the shadows of the kitchen. She saw the way Rhett's hands shook as he tied the leather straps. She saw the light dying out of her son's eyes. For 2 years, she had let the town define her. She had accepted their whispers as her truth, believing that survival meant being invisible. But as she looked at the blue silk Rhett had sacrificed his only protection to buy, something inside her snapped. It wasn't the sound of breaking. It was the sound of a fire catching. "Unpack that bag, Rhett," Clara said. Rhett looked up, startled. "Clara, if I stay, they'll take him. You heard the sheriff." "Let them try," she hissed, her eyes blazing. "I have spent my whole life being ashamed of things I didn't do. I've let them treat me like a dog because my stepfather was a wolf. But you are a good man, and this is my home. Tomorrow is the spring social in town. We aren't hiding anymore." "Clara, they'll tear you apart," Rhett warned. "Let them try," she repeated. "We're going to that dance. Together." The Blackwood Town Hall was filled with the smell of sawdust, cider, and cheap perfume. The fiddle music was lively, a celebration of the coming warmth, but the atmosphere curdled the moment the doors swung open. Clara Thorne walked in first. She wore the blue silk dress, sewn by her own hand and Martha's throughout the night. It was the color of a summer sky after a storm. Beside her stood Rhett Dackett, his boots polished, his head held high, even without a gun at his hip. Between them, Silas walked with his chest puffed out, holding his mother's hand. The fiddle player's bow screeched to a halt. The dancing stopped. Pastor Yates stepped out from the crowd, his face purpling. "You have a lot of nerve, woman. I told you." "You told me nothing I care to hear, Pastor," Clara interrupted, her voice ringing through the hall. "You talk of sin? This man sacrificed his life for a family that wasn't his. He sold the only thing he owned to feed a hungry child, while you were busy counting the collection plate. If that's sin, then I'll take it over your version of heaven any day." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked away in shame. Others, the younger ranchers who had seen Rhett's gun in the saloon, looked at him with newfound respect. "We're here to dance," Clara said, looking directly at the townspeople. "And we're here to stay. Rhett Dackett is staying on the Thorne Ranch. He's going to be my husband. And if any of you want to take my son, You'll have to go through both of us." She turned to Rhett and held out her hand. Rhett hesitated for a heartbeat. He looked at the hostile faces, then at the woman who had pulled a bullet from his leg and hope from his heart. He took her hand. The fiddle player, a young man who had always hated the pastor's gloom, struck up a slow, haunting waltz. They danced. It wasn't a graceful thing. Rhett still limped and Clara was trembling, but it was the most beautiful thing the town of Blackwood had ever seen. It was a dance of defiance. One by one, a few other couples returned to the floor. The wall of hatred hadn't crumbled entirely, but the first stone had been kicked loose. A month later, the Bitterroot Range was green with new life. The Thorn Farm was no longer a place of hiding, it was a place of building. Rhett stood with Clara by the creek that fed their land. The water was rushing, clear and cold from the melting snow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a ring, carved painstakingly from a piece of dark mountain mahogany, inlaid with a shard of bright turquoise he had found in the stream bed. "It isn't gold," Rhett said, his voice rough, "and I don't have a gun or a horse of my own anymore. All I have is a name I'm trying to make clean again." Clara took the ring, sliding it onto her finger. It was warm from his pocket. It was imperfect, handmade, and stronger than any iron. "I don't need gold, Rhett," she whispered, pulling him close. "I've had enough of things that glitter and turn to ash. I just need you." As the sun set behind the peaks, casting a golden glow over the homestead, Silas's laughter echoed from the barn. They were no longer outcasts. They were a family, born not of blood or law, but of a blizzard, a bullet, and the courage to believe that even in the harshest wilderness, something beautiful can grow. In the end, Clara and Rhett didn't just survive the winter. They survived the world's judgment. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance and a place to call home, hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more tales from the frontier. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Where in the world are you watching from today? And what time is it where you are? Drop your location and the local time in the comments below. Let's see how many time zones the Bitterroot Reckoning has reached.